Hey there, it's Jason from Codemanship, and welcome to When Twitter Polls Go Wrong. I ran a poll this week asking developers, what I thought I was asking developers is whether or not they either have or believe they could handle a software project entirely by themselves, working directly with the customer. Now, in my mind, what I meant was commercial projects, actually paying customers. And the results of the poll were initially very, very encouraging. A full 80% of us believe that we either have or that we could handle a software development effort entirely by ourselves if it was a certain size, if it was relatively modest. But I'm not sure I buy it for two reasons. Number one, from personal experience, I haven't met that many developers who really have done it all by themselves. And we'll get into what I mean by that in a minute. But also, based on some of the actual replies that I got, I'm beginning to wonder how many of these people who said that they had done it or they could do it were actually really thinking about side projects. So not doing it for money, not doing it for paid customers. What's the difference? Well, there's a world of difference. If you imagine, for example, you're a guitar player. Now, I play the guitar and I play it for fun, not for profit, and I occasionally create music and I post it online, and I don't get any money out of it and don't get a lot of satisfaction out of it, to be honest. But it's a very different prospect to, for example, being a professional guitar player. If you're a professional session guitarist, for example, as I tried once and didn't like it one bit, then it's a whole different kettle of fish, whole different world, because the first thing that happens is you actually spend less time playing guitar because there's a whole bunch of other things you need to worry about. Everything from contracts and finance and getting the money. That's always a hard part. But also you need to understand things like intellectual property and copyright and publishing. On top of which you have to have a very different attitude to gear. You need a lot more gear because paying customers might want you to be able to do a whole bunch of different things. So you can't just have the one guitar. You've got to have a range of different guitars. You've got to keep them in perfect shape, which means you're getting setups done professionally on a very regular basis. So you need a guitar tech. You can of course learn to do that yourself, but it's a very skilled job. And you need to understand all of this equipment and how it works and how to make it sound its best. So you need to think a bit like a sound engineer as well as a luthier, as well as your booking manager and the person who books your hotels and organizes your travel, and all of those other issues that tend to come up. On top of which, you also spend quite a lot of your time promoting yourself. I've seen a lot of people do software development, for example, where they built something and they thought, well, I've done that now. And then nobody uses it because what they didn't realize is that marketing is 90% of the work. So there's a whole bunch of other stuff that comes into play the moment you start charging money for it. Then you have to do what your customer wants, which is why most professional guitar players spend their lives playing 3-chord pop songs. Well, now, where's the satisfaction in that, really? Well, as guitar players, what they do very often is they will do their own stuff in their own time, have their own bands or make their own albums. So there are a lot of, jazz and jazz fusion albums out there, a lot of metal and progressive metal, fiddly, complicated, widdly stuff out there that would not exist if people were not prepared to make it for little or no money. They're doing it just purely for the job satisfaction. It's the satisfaction that they seek on the side. It's the control that they seek on the side that they don't have during the working day. And software development's a little bit like that. These side projects, I see them as developers. These are the jazz fusion albums of software developers. We're playing 3-chord pop songs during the day for banks and retailers and law firms and et cetera, et cetera. And then in our spare time, we're making our magnum opus, which maybe 12 people will buy. But we don't care who buys it. That's not why we do it. And there's a lot of great open source software, for example, that was done for that reason and that would not exist otherwise. There's not a client out there that would be willing to pay for it to be developed, because software is expensive when you're making it from scratch. But it turns out it's something that needs to exist and that wouldn't exist otherwise. Plus, doing your own stuff, it's very proactive learning. you know, you're taking control of your own sort of learning there and saying, well, I want to have a go at this, which you might not get a chance to do during the day because it's not really up to you a lot of the time. So I'm kind of drawing a distinction here between writing software for fun, for personal satisfaction, for personal control, like side projects, like open source software, and writing software for paying clients, which brings in a whole world of other considerations around finance and contracts and legal and licensing and disaster recovery and operations and hosting and all this other stuff that you need to think about. That's not just about the programming. You will probably spend less time programming when you're doing it directly, when you're doing all of it. Now, why did I ask this question in the first place? Well, it's all really about the sort of the roadmap that I'm cooking up at the moment for codemanship. So as you'll see from the Twitter profile that we've got here, Codemanship is a leading provider of live instructor-led online training and coaching in TDD, refactoring design principles and continuous delivery. Now, I don't own the term, so it's not up to me. Don't take this as me telling you you're not a software developer. But I like to draw a distinction between a software developer and a programmer, in the same way that it's useful to draw a distinction between a building contractor and a bricklayer. A building contractor may be a bricklayer, but it's not the same thing. A building contractor has to worry about a lot more than bricks, a lot more than bricks. When we talk in terms of this idea of a full stack developer, which is it's a bit of a vague term and a bit of a nonsense, but I kind of get the sentiment, which is, do you know enough programming languages and enough technologies to build a complete application? So do you know enough HTML and CSS and JavaScript and maybe some Java and maybe some SQL to build a complete website, for example? So I kind of see where they're going with this. But what about the full lifecycle developers? Do you know enough about customers and requirements and contracts and privacy and disaster recovery and all these other things you need to think about? And that's where this question was going. Do you know enough about the whole software development lifecycle, the whole sort of shebang, as it were, to do it all by yourself, working directly with a customer? Over the years, I have. It's not easy, but it is incredibly educational. Because as programmers, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on around us that we're often not privy to. We don't see it, and we don't know that it's there. For example, procurement. Where do those licenses and those laptops come from? So there's a whole bunch of stuff that we're not aware of that definitely exists, and it can definitely hurt us. And very often the stuff that's going on around us, particularly when it comes to things like finance and contracts, dictates how software development has to be done. So a lot of the reason behind why there's still so much sort of fixed scope, fixed time, fixed cost going on is because for many companies, that's the only way they can win the business, or at least they think it is. So by the time we get involved as programmers, a lot of expectations have already been set about how this is going to work, which means we are not in control. Now, one of the sort of the foundations of agile software development is self-organizing teams that have a lot of autonomy. With great autonomy comes great responsibility. In order to be in control of the things that we need to be in control of, we need, in terms of the code, we need to be in control of a whole bunch of other stuff around the code, including how the project is managed, how the bidding was done, if there was bidding involved, and so on and so forth, so that we can set those expectations ourselves. So I genuinely believe that the only way that we're going to get more autonomous development teams at the technical level is if they take more control outside of that. In other words, the teams effectively manage not just themselves, but they manage the whole thing. So I have a sort of a vision of the future of software development teams sort of evolving into something much more like architectural practices or law firms or something like that, where the developers are in charge. There may be support services that they hire in, but they're calling the shots. And I know teams who've done this, who've worked together within a client, been managed by the client, but enjoyed working together so much that they went off and formed their own company and they bid for projects themselves. And that means that they can set the expectations, they're in control, they can walk away, They can say, okay, we don't want to work with this client, or we think that this is, if you'll pardon my French, this is going to be a shit show. So let's not get involved. Life's too short. So they take more control. All of that promise of agile is kind of built on that. It does need developers to have much more control, much more autonomy. And I don't believe we're going to get it until we seize the reins. But seizing the reins puts us in a very different space. It takes us from being bricklayers or bedroom guitar players into being building contractors or professional musicians. It's a whole different prospect. And a lot of developers in my career, I've seen run screaming into the hills at the prospect of getting involved in these things. They don't want to, and that's why they're programmers. They're quite happy where they are. And I say, good luck to you. You will always be doing what people tell you to do, because the agenda will be dictated by the people around what you're doing, and not by you. You have very little influence over that. So if you want autonomy, you are going to have to seize the means of production, which in this case means us. We are the means of production in software development. You need to seize yourself, gently now, but you need to seize yourself and take control. And that means you will need to get involved in bidding and contracts and financial stuff and legal stuff and hiring when hiring is involved. So that's what this question was really about. Have you done it, or could you do it entirely by yourself, working directly with the customer? And I do mean all of it. And I have this kind of vision for co-ownership now, that we've been very focused on the technical practice over the last 10 years, but my roadmap for what I call a software developer, it's not necessarily what you call it, but what I call a software developer is wider than that and longer than that. So I have a vision now of extending this so that the code craft is like phase one. So let's imagine there are 4 phases of the life cycle of a software developer in terms of their development, their learning. Phase 1 is learning how to make the computer do stuff. So programming, coding. And that might take you a year or two to just wrap your head around how to make the computer do things. Phase 2 is to how to make it do it well. So that's the code craft side of things, where we consider the maintainability of the code in particular, but all those other issues, the quality of the code, the reliability, and get into things like unit testing and TDD and behavior-driven development and continuous delivery and all that wonderful stuff. But there is a world outside of that. There's a whole world outside of that stuff. So I envisage a phase 3 where we widen that and we start to talk about architecture and design, get developers involved more upfront and involved at a higher level in a bigger picture, making bigger decisions, making some of those irreversible decisions about, well, let's go with Oracle instead of SQL Server or whatever. And understanding the rationale behind those decisions and being capable of making good decisions at that level. So we're moving them into a kind of an architecture space. But again, there is a world outside of the software architecture, and that's the final phase, the phase 4, where I see the co-ownership roadmap evolving to, where we say, okay, and now let's do it for a real paying customer, and by the way, you're in charge. Where they then have to learn about all the other stuff and how that can drive everything else. It can dictate how everything else works. It dictates the architecture. It dictates the approach. Can we really be iterative? Can we really be agile if we're going to be bidding for projects in this kind of way? And I see that as the final part of the development of what I call a software developer, in the same way that I might call someone a building contractor. So still a programmer, hopefully, still a programmer, but with a much wider appreciation. And if you were hiring bricklayers, who would you rather hire? A bricklayer who understands why the scaffolding needs to be that high for safety reasons or for legal reasons or insurance reasons, or a bricklayer who doesn't care, or someone else takes care of all of that. Now, it's very easy if you're a programmer to be blinkered to the fact that all this stuff is going on. A lot of it is hidden from us. We don't really see that it's going on in the background. And we don't realize that it's not actually the background. As far as the customer is concerned, we're in the background and all this stuff is in the foreground. So all the important decisions are being made without us. But we could be forgiven for not knowing those decisions are actually being made on a day-to-day basis, for not having any real sort of practical appreciation of what's really going into it. Which is why I think even if you don't intend to work in those kind of leadership roles, I think you need to be, at least have a practical appreciation of why it works the way that it works, and what works and what doesn't work, so that you can be a better bricklayer, a bricklayer who understands the context of the work that they're doing and how it fits in with everything else. So that's what this poll was really about. I've got a sneaking suspicion that the responses, that many of those responses, people would have been thinking side projects, and I think side projects are a great thing, but my point is they are a whole different ball of wax. A whole different ball of wax to doing it commercially for real paying customers. And I don't think we're going to get the autonomy that we really desire until we start getting involved in that stuff. And I think a great way to learn that stuff is to do a small self-contained project entirely by yourself. Doesn't teach you everything, doesn't teach you how to work with teams, doesn't teach you about hiring, etc., etc. There's still more that we need to bring in. But a good start would be, could you build a kitchen extension on your own? So there you go. That's what it was really about. I might try again at some point. I would like to really know what the answer to this question is. In my experience, not that many of us have really done this. Not that many of us would really want to. If you're enjoying the video diary or any of the other videos I've been posting, then ring the bell of notifications and subscribe. There'll be another diary hopefully next week. I might try and rope someone in, so we'll talk about this a bit more maybe next week. We'll see how gregarious he's feeling. But until then, take care, stay safe, and enjoy the beginning of spring.